Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories, 11 in total. I hope you all enjoy them. I always try to do my best to make sure that the stories are as good as possible, and I think this video is no exception. If you do enjoy them, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 1 likes on this video. I'd really appreciate it. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. Anyways, sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax. I don't judge. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. Her name was Karina, I think. It's weird. You'd think I'd remember her name properly. She was certainly unique. We met in Psych 101 back in college. She was a little shy and had a bit of a goth aesthetic. I'm not usually bold, but I took a swing at talking to her, and we actually got along okay. Okay enough that I asked her on a date a few weeks into the semester, and she said yes. We grabbed a bite to eat. I almost expected her to be vegan, but no. Ordered a big, juicy steak. Somehow I can remember that, but not her name. She was pretty reserved at first, but I got her to open up by asking about her interests. The girl loved horror movies. She actually kind of lit up when she started talking about them. I would just smile and nod. I didn't dislike horror movies or anything. I can appreciate a good scare, but I wasn't in love with them or anything. Karina? She was. So much so, she actually invited me back to her place to watch one with her after our first date. I was a bit surprised at the proposition, but I agreed. She was cute. Her place was huge. I guess her family had money. A lot of it. They boarded her in a sizable house, almost a mansion with no roommates. I definitely found it odd, but I quickly grew to appreciate it. At least for a while. That first night we watched a pretty standard slasher. She didn't seem too into the movie, and I didn't think too much about it myself, as we didn't end up watching the whole thing. We got distracted. We started hanging out more, but pretty early on it became clear that staying in and watching horror movies was her favorite pastime. I asked her to be my girlfriend anyway. While I wasn't a huge fan of the films, the nights spent doing this always ended eventfully. But the movies, they got worse. She got braver in what she wanted to watch with me, and she'd get more excited. Pretty soon we were watching some pretty brutal stuff. Movies I wasn't exactly comfortable with. I didn't know how to approach the subject because she seems to thoroughly enjoy them. A bit too much. I started to notice that her excitement always seemed to coincide with the more graphic scenes. And honestly, the gorier and more deranged, the more wild she got. I would enjoy myself, but the backdrop of the movie, it was more than a little off-putting. I remember trying to turn it off one time. It was like I had to hit the power button on her instead. She stopped almost immediately, telling me she was tired. She seemed annoyed, but didn't say anything directly. I started to get the sense that she had an unhealthy obsession with some pretty dark stuff. I knew things wouldn't last, but I was having fun, even if the films had gotten more than a little disturbing. I remember it getting to the point where they weren't even mass-distributed films. They were grainy and, God, some of them felt real. It was one night like that. The last night. We were watching some VHS tape of what seemed to be a man being tortured. It felt too real. I tried to let her know it was making me uncomfortable, but just like every other time I tried to broach the subject, she was almost immediately on top of me. She was extra energetic that night, and after some of the things she did, well, the man's screams suddenly weren't so distracting. Though, they were there, and they came into sudden focus after I heard the doorbell ring. Karina gasped, giddy with excitement, and dashed to the door. I stood and tried to peer the far distance into the entry hall from her spacious living room, and I saw her excitedly lifting a sizable package. The screams from the TV subsided to whimpers as blood spilled from the tortured man. She looked back at me then, and her expression faltered a bit. "I'll be right back. Just have to put this away," she had said, before disappearing into a side hallway that I had never given much thought to before. Her voice had a strange quiver. It seemed like excitement and nervousness mixed. My curiosity was piqued. I tried asking her what she got once she returned, but she merely resumed her vigorous activities. We took it up to her bedroom, and that night was like nothing I had been up to that point. She was invigorated. Our activities eventually subsided, and I laid back in her black-clad bed, closing my eyes. I could feel her staring at me. I peeked an eye open, and she quickly looked away. She laid then too, without saying anything. I tried to cuddle with her, but she was rigid and unyielding. Something seemed off, and I felt the unease that had slowly been settling in about to creep into my mind. I knew I had to end things. She was disturbed. I remained quiet. So did she. We laid there for a long time. Sleep couldn't find me. I felt uneasy. This was not helped by the fact that every 20 minutes or so, I would feel her sit up, and I would sense her staring at me. I peeked once or twice. It was a cold stare. I could always make out some sort of noise or other indication that I was not fully asleep, and she would quickly return to lying down. Eventually her breathing did slow, and she appeared to drift off. I could not follow her there. Something was off, and I felt like it had to do with the package. After a time, I decided that I wouldn't be able to sleep, not until I knew what made Karina behave so strangely. An invasion of privacy, I know, but in the dead of night, I slipped out of bed all the same. I crept down the stairs that led back down to the living room, careful not to creak any loose floorboards. It was a lovely house, but a bit old. When I got to the bottom, I realized we had left the tape running. The man, he was dead. His arms and legs were missing, and he just lay in a pool of blood on the floor. But I could tell the tape was still playing. I knew that no movie would show a dead body for that long. I hastened to the hallway that had taken the package down before, and even debated leaving then, but curiosity gnawed at me. I walked down the hallway, realizing that I had never been in it. There were 3 doors, a bathroom, a linen closet, and a locked door at the end of the hallway. It was a traditional lock, and I snuck back to the entryway to find her keys sitting on a small table. There were 2 keys on her ring, other than the one to her Mercedes. I went back and tried them both. One must have been for her house, and I guess the other was for the mailbox or something, because neither worked. I decided to leave it be and just try to get some rest. I snuck back upstairs and was about to lay down when I noticed her clasp bag a few inches from her fingers on a side table. She went everywhere with that thing. I had even noticed her checking it obsessively on several occasions. Another invasion of privacy, but I couldn't help it. I quietly lifted the flap and poked around inside it. Lo and behold, there was a small pocket on the inside, and in that pocket, a pearly key. I remember her stirring when I set the bag back down. I stood stock still until her movement subsided. Then I snuck back down the stairs. The key fit. It unlocked the door, and behind that door, a nightmare. On display in clear cases were dozens of dismembered body parts. Some seemed preserved, others, not so much. The smell was not egregious outside of the room, but inside I wanted to vomit. There seemed to be intricate ventilation systems inside each case, but honestly, that's not what I was focusing on. I remember the one closest to the door, a human leg severed at the knee. It had been opened up like a medical display, but it was clearly for artistic effect. Strips of flesh were cut away to form intricate patterns. Blood still seeped from the cuts. It was clearly still fresh. I stumbled further into the room. I saw many things I I don't enjoy recalling them, but I feel like some of it is important. I saw a woman's severed head on display, with a cool blue light illuminating it. The bottom jaw had been split in two, leaving the two halves dangling down instead of meeting at her chin. It was not one of the well-preserved specimens. I think the worst was the knot of small appendages. Too small, obviously children's. They were broken and twisted in impossible ways to make some symbolic-seeming knot. It was hanging above the main attraction, a terrified-looking woman who had clearly been dismembered and restitched back together, but backwards. Every joint had been severed, only to be reattached in the opposite direction. Her head was on backwards. Even dead and mutilated, her last expression showed primal terror. She too did not appear to have been dead long. I could go on, but I don't think I actually spent much time in there. Not long enough to even think of taking a picture. Not before I heard her voice from the doorway behind me. "Do you like them?" I'll never forget that question. Asked quietly and sweetly, and in the most menacing way I have ever heard. I turned to look at her. She was in a white sleeping gown. Her black hair was disheveled. Her pale skin glowed. So did the knife in her hand. She charged me. It was a jerky and unnatural movement. She tackled me with a strength that seemed incongruent to her small stature. She straddled me in a perverse reflection of our previous activities, only now she ruthlessly stabbed the knife down at me. 147 stitches. That's how many I ended up needing, mostly on my cheek and neck, but a few on my face. It's a miracle none of her attacks nicked anything important. She wasn't a big girl. I managed to throw her off. And believe me when I say I tore out of that house like a bat out of hell. I remember her ragged screeches as she chased me out with that bloody knife. I never looked back, but I can picture that black hair flailing, that deranged face grinning. She was gone once the cops got to her house. So were her grotesque collectibles. At least, that's what they told me. The officers didn't seem to want to look me in the eye. I never heard from her again, never saw anything on the news. Hell, I don't know if I would even recognize if I had. I can't even seem to remember her last name, but I know what I saw. I've got the scars to prove it. Whoever she was, whatever she was. I hoped she was gone, but last week I got a package. It was a child's arm severed at the joints and reassembled in reverse. I of course reported it to the authorities, but there was no information on the package, and somehow nothing on my doorbell camera, despite it clearly being hand-delivered. But I've got a pretty good idea of who it's from. Never in my life did I imagine having such a job as this, yet here I was. I found a job listing for a company called Bell, Home Security and Surveillance, with paid training. Bills were stacking up and I wasn't getting any replies, so I filled out an application. Received an email almost instantly telling me I got the job. No interview? I thought. A document contract was attached to the email, a DMCA. The email read that I got the job, and to keep it, I had to sign the contract and essentially promise not to speak or share details of my training and position. I was in no position to argue or complain, so I signed. Didn't even read the entire contract, which I know I should have. Come October 1st, it was time for my big first day. I was asked to arrive around 9 p.m. Seemed like I would have the graveyard shift. I put the address on my GPS, but nothing came up. I searched it up and nothing. As I was about to email the company, my GPS automatically refreshed and started giving directions. I was puzzled, but paid it no mind. Didn't want to be late on my first day. I started the engine and drove off. The office building lied far from the city in the outskirts, deep, and I mean deep into the vast woods. A road veered off from the highway, which I had to take to get there. I drove across the bridge over a small river and finally arrived at my destination. The building had a weird shape to it, unlike anything I seen. Instead of your usual boxy structure, the building was tilted as if about to fall over. No windows or doors were visible, just white walls without a single speck of dirt or dust. I left my car at the parking lot before the building and got out. I approached the wall, which suddenly slid open. A man in a black tuxedo greeted me. "Mr. James Morgan, welcome to Bell. We're happy to have you." "I'm happy to be here." I shook his hand and followed him inside. We walked down various empty halls with no rooms in sight. I remember looking up to see the walls reach for the sky with no ceiling in sight. The man stopped at a corner and pressed his hand against the wall, which slid open the entrance. Inside was a small office complete with a desk, computer, and 3 chairs. Cabinets and drawers were stacked with papers. "Please, Mr. Morgan, take a seat." I took the closest seat as he took the one behind the desk. "Mr. Morgan, here at Bell Home Security and Surveillance, we take our job graciously in ensuring safety to our customers from all dangers." I just nodded as he went along. "Danger comes in many forms: theft, break-in, but we specifically specialize in a very specific kind of danger." "What kind of danger?" "Tell me, Mr. Morgan, do you believe in ghosts?" Lost for words, I wasn't sure how to respond. I mean, how do you respond to such a question in such an out-of-place scenario? I'm an open-minded person. I see what I believe. "Do you know why the company's name and logo is a bell?" "No." "It's named after the Bell family, a religious family that lived in a church, with a notable bell tower." He retrieved an old photo from the cabinet behind him and placed it on the desk. "They were known for ringing the bell every time danger appeared, to alert the town not from any invading armies, but from witches." Taken aback from his words, I glanced down at the photo to find an old family from the 1800s holding pitchforks and torches. "That's where it began, and we have continued their legacy ever since." "Wait, you're a home security company that warns people about ghosts?" "We wait for a sign of paranormal activity, thoroughly investigate it from here, using the cameras and sensors. If needed, we also use our hidden drones to properly scout the place." He returned the photo to the cabinet and continued. "If a creature or otherworldly entity poses a threat, we immediately send a list of instructions to our client that share just enough details to know what type of entity is in their house and what to do." He leaned back on his chair and held his hands together. "As our friends back here guide the client to safety, a team is dispatched to that location to deal with the entity. They then have 3 options: capture the entity, neutralize it, or eliminate it." "So you're ghost hunters?" "We're no different than any other home security organization. We just take it a little further." Unreal, I thought. A dream. If not, then what? "Okay, so what am I going to do exactly?" "You'll be part of the team that deals with the entities directly. That's where the paid training comes into play." He stands up and waves me towards the door. "After you." We left his office and headed further into the hallways, eventually coming across a locker from near a giant garage. A guy in a black uniform stepped out. "James Morgan, I take it?" I shake his hand. "Pleasure to meet you." "The name's Michael Waters, and the pleasure is all mine." A little bell was pinned to his shirt along with the name tag. "Let's get you into one of these, shall we?" I nodded my head and turned to find the previous man now gone. Didn't recall hearing his footsteps either. In the locker room, I was handed a black t-shirt and pants, a belt with a few pouches for storing stuff, and a little bell and name tag. "Nervous?" Michael asked. "Are we really ghost hunters, or was that man just messing with me?" "What man?" The man, the guy in the tuxedo that walked me over here, he was standing right next to me. Oh, I see. Don't worry. Nobody could see the woman that hired me either. Michael began loading equipment onto a black van with a satellite on top, a giant yellow bell on its side. Really pushes the little theory me and my folks got going on. And what's that? The company is run by ghosts. Good ghosts hunting bad ghosts? Or something else and probably much worse. Yeah, we help people, but I think it's all theatrics. What do you mean by that? Ghosts or not, you need money to get your resources, so they pose as a home security company, help people on the side who then talk about the great, wonderful customer service we provide, refer their friends and families. Pretend to be the good guys so people pay them to do what they only care about? Yes, not every time though. Some of my folks were told to purposefully leave customers in danger and fend for themselves. Can't sell home security if all homes are safe, you know? It was a lot to take in. I was ready to just leave and pretend this was just a bad dream, but I guess Michael took notice. I wouldn't leave. It's too late now. Too late? I don't know what happens when you leave. I do know that everyone that quits or walks out is never seen from again. I froze in place. Did Michael just threaten me? Had a good friend. He applied for this job despite my disagreement. You see, they find us losers who are stuck in debt. People that can't find a job. Promise us a huge paycheck. They do pay us. He placed a container into the van and shut the doors. But when my friend decided he had enough, he walked out and couldn't find him anywhere. Never went home. Nobody's seen him. Michael takes the keys from the wall and heads towards the front of the van. I reluctantly stepped into the passenger seat as he took the driver's. We're in this together now, James. I got your back if you got mine's. I sighed, accepting my fate. Michael started the van and we drove off. We were driving along the highway when a female voice came over the radio. Agents Waters and Morgan, possible level 4 entity detected. Level 4 entity? An entity that can't be dealt with or handled. What about the other levels? A level 5 entity can be left alone. A level 4 entity can only be left alone under surveillance. Level 3 is an entity that must be dealt with right away. Level 2 is an entity that has a very specific way of dealing with. Level 1 is an entity that is out of our control. What levels are more frequent? Level 4 is the most common. I haven't been called to deal with any entities above them. We finally arrived at the address the female voice sent us and parked the van up front. Michael got out of the car and walked up to the house. I followed behind. He handed me an earpiece as he placed another in his ear. It's so Sharon can communicate with us. Sharon? The lady in the radio. Oh. Michael was about to knock on the door when we heard Sharon again. The client has vacated the premises. Proceed to enter. He carefully pushed the door open and stepped inside. I walked in after him and looked around the dark living room. I was ready to try the switch, but Michael stopped me. Even something as simple as the light turning on could upset or trigger these things. Best to leave it alone for now. He pulled out a tablet from the bag he was carrying and switched it on. It glowed a blue hue, bright enough to see the screen and nothing else. What are you doing? Just getting ready to gather some information. I glanced around and waited to see any sort of sign that a ghost was present. Nothing. Sharon, can you tell us what you got? Affirmative. Level 4 entity detected at 22:41 hours. Subject has the appearance of a female, 11 years in age. Subject is currently upstairs on the first bedroom to the right. Will do. I followed Michael upstairs to the mentioned room. When we entered, we did indeed find the girl Sharon was talking about. Up to this point, I was just playing along with everyone else. Was still having trouble believing everything I'd been told. But any and all doubts went away as I laid my eyes on the girl. She was normal in terms of looks. She just so happened to be standing on the goddamn ceiling. Michael? Sharon, we found the entity. He proceeded to approach the girl. Hey, sweetie, why don't you go ahead and come down to us? I stayed by the door and watched as Michael pulled out a piece of candy from his pouch. I got candy. You like candy? As he unwrapped and offered it to her, the girl started to slowly descend. My eyes widened and heart raced as red, bloody hands ripped through the girl's feet as the body lowered itself. The right hand inside the girl's left foot let go of the ceiling and reached for the candy. I can't even, nor do I want to describe where the head of the thing came out from. All I'll say is it came from between her legs. The thing snatched the candy out of Michael's grasp and shoved it in its mouth. Other parts of its body soon began to emerge out of the skin, like a person with no flesh who put on their clothes backwards, wearing the shirt as pants and the pants as a shirt. All you could make out from what parts were visible was that the thing had no skin, and probably why it used the girl's corpse as clothing. Michael seemed so unfazed, yet I was starting to panic. I lost my cool and darted downstairs and towards the exit. James, no! I heard a piercing cry behind me, accompanied by a loud crash. I turned around to find the thing chasing me. The skin of the girl it was wearing started peeling away. I screamed and reached for the door when Michael opened fire on the thing. It stumbled into the wall and onto the floor. The thing was still breathing, but severely wounded. Sharon, we require medical attention. I checked for any injuries on myself and looked at Michael. I'm fine. It's not for you or me. He pressed his 2 fingers against the thing's neck. You want to save that thing? It tried to kill me. It's the job. Capture these things and keep them out of trouble. You're insane. You filled out the application and put on the uniform. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. I'm leaving. I told you what happens if you leave. Coincidence, that's all. Okay, if you are so sure, go ahead. Walk away. I hate this job. I think the reason I get away talking about it is because no one would in their right mind believe such a ridiculous story. Still work there, of course. The pay is beyond great. I got my own house now, car of my dreams. Thought if I lived a good life doing what I always wanted to do, it would take my mind away from the horrors I have to live through working there. But every morning, after saying goodbye to Michael and heading home, I dread the day that we both encounter something beyond our control. The day we don't clock out. I write this now to anyone who may dare read and take my story to heart. Well, I still can tell that story, because tonight I go back to work. Michael called me in the late afternoon telling me to have a nice meal and do an activity I love. We survived this long, Michael. We can push through another night. It's a level 2. Hi, I'm posting my story here because of what is happening to my house. I need help and I don't know what to do. I live in Minnesota. I moved here a year ago to start a master's degree. The area I live in is beautiful and I have already made a life here. I have great friends, an amazing girlfriend, and there are a lot of opportunities career-wise for when I graduate. This place is my home. I live in a small rental house, just big enough for myself and my cat. It came at a cheap cost, especially considering the area I'm in. Of course, I knew it might be a paranormal red flag, but I took a chance anyways. Honestly, the idea of some activity was comforting in a way. You see, I have been having paranormal experiences since I was 5 years old. Every place I have ever lived in has had at least some activity, most of it harmless, some not so much. I didn't get a weird vibe when I toured the place, and at that price, how could I say no? It started off small, as things tend to do. An object out of place here and there, and my hairbrush went missing only to return a few days later in the exact spot I had left it. Okay, harmless enough, so I left it be. About a month after moving in, a friend I had made in one of my classes came to my place to eat some dinner and have a few drinks to wind down from a busy weekend. The red wine kept pouring, and soon enough, my friend had to use the restroom. She came back to the living room laughing slightly. I asked what was funny, and she told me that I was the biggest neat freak she had ever met. I do like to keep things organized, but it's not obsessive, and I've never been called a neat freak before. I gave her a quizzical look, and in response she said, "Oh, you know, the way you've organized your bathroom." I kept things set up as most people do, so when I asked her what she meant by neat freak, she beckoned me to come look. As I walked into the bathroom, it looked nothing like it had before my friend had come over. Every single thing I kept in my bathroom was lined up in a perfect row, from the biggest item to the smallest. "Oh," I said, clearly thinking she had done this as a joke. I didn't know her all that well, after all, so I thought maybe she just had a weird sense of humor. I stared at the formation for one more second, and after an awkward pause, we went back into the living room to finish dinner. Things were quiet for about a week. Then one Saturday morning, I walked to my kitchen to start a cup of coffee. I stopped in my tracks as I saw the silverware. Every utensil I owned was sprawled out on my kitchen table, but not randomly. Every fork, spoon, and knife were in a perfect circle, all pointing inward. A chill crept down my neck. Somehow this seemed more sinister than a missing hairbrush. 2 days after the silverware incident, I came home from class later than usual. I flicked on all the lights, said hello to my cat, and meandered into the living room. I froze. All the cans in my cupboards were stacked, one on top of the other. It looked impossibly tall and definitely not stable enough to hold itself up like that. My breath caught in my throat as I looked further into my living room. Every piece of furniture downstairs had all been piled up, with one chair sitting on top. It looked like someone had broken in, built a Christmas tree out of furniture, and placed the smallest chair on top, like some messed up star. I had heard of these types of hauntings before, but in all my years of attracting entities, this was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Of course, I tried to think of anything logical that could explain this. Maybe someone had broken into my house and played the most insane trick on me, but there was no forced entry, and I had the only key. I took some deep breaths and reminded myself that I wasn't being harmed physically, and my cat seemed to be fine. So I took on the long task of undoing everything. I was starting to feel really uneasy being home. Either my cat sensed it, or he was noticing things too, as he started staring at random corners, tracking things with his eyes. Animals can sense things like that, and again, it wasn't doing any real harm, so I reassured my cat, and we went to bed. My cat always sleeps next to me, but when I woke up, he wasn't in the room. Unlike him, but not unheard of. I got out of bed and felt the strong urge to check on my cat. I called his name, looking in every room, until the only room that was left was the kitchen. As I walked in, I screamed. There was my cat, covered in a red goo. My God, I thought. That can't be blood. Please don't let that be blood. I approached him slowly. He looked at me nervously, but he didn't seem to be hurt. I examined the substance only to discover it was ketchup. I opened my fridge and the ketchup bottle that had been nearly full was almost empty, with the cap still open. Up until now, the entity had only been interacting with inanimate things, but now, it was messing with my cat. I can handle a lot, but when something starts interacting with a living being, I knew that what I was dealing with was no normal entity. Mess with me, sure, but leave my cat alone. So I did what I always do with an unwanted visitor. I demanded that it leave and never come back. I told it was not wanted here, and was no longer allowed to be here. Somehow this only made things worse. I went to bed that night and made sure to lock my cat in my bedroom with me. Telling things to go away usually worked, but this was on a whole other realm. It was the most unrestful night of my life. I woke up groggy the next day, running everything through my head that had happened so far. I needed help, but who could I turn to? As I was brainstorming who might be able to help, a priest, a psychic, I walked to my bathroom. I flicked the lights on and almost screamed in horror. Staying was written all over the walls in various substances, with toothpaste to shampoo. I almost fell as I backed out of my bathroom. My eyes scanned every surface of the hallway, the living room walls, and all over the kitchen, only to be met with thousands of staying, written over and over again, and balanced perfectly upright on the kitchen table, was my biggest kitchen knife. But that's not the worst part. Whatever this thing has had ripped a picture of some old friends and me off the wall. It had torn the picture up, leaving only my face intact. The picture of me was speared right through my eye with the tip of the knife. Please, I don't know what to do. I don't even know what I'm dealing with. I don't think moving out of this house will help. This thing will follow me. The house is not haunted. I am. Until very recently, I worked for a company that manufactures parts for large medical equipment. For my own anonymity, I'm going to keep the details vague. All you really need to know is that I worked with big chunks of metal in a relatively small factory in the middle of nowhere. I've been in the metalworking field for quite a while at this point, and I've seen my fair share of industrial accidents over the years. I've long since come to terms with the fact that an occasional gnarly gash or painful abrasion is par for the course in my line of work. In fact, almost all of my coworkers at that factory had endured some kind of minor injury in their career. All except for one. One of my former coworkers was this guy called Lawrence. He was a loner, mid-30s, and quiet to the point of being antisocial. Although he didn't really engage with us other guys, he was pleasant enough. Never rude or anything like that, but not particularly friendly either. People still tried to joke around with him all the time, though, mainly about the fact that he seemed to never get hurt, or even react to things that should be painful. It became a running joke of sorts that he was indestructible. I think people were trying to encourage him to socialize, but it ended up annoying him more than anything else. Generally, he tolerated the joke with a wry sort of grace. There was clearly some amount of truth to the joke, though. Lawrence would regularly touch burning hot metal or chemical irritants without so much as a flinch. It was impressive what he could endure, albeit concerning. The running gag was only reinforced when, about a year ago, Lawrence had an incident with a milling machine. He was using the thing as he usually did, with no personal protective equipment whatsoever. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but a thin hunk of metal about the size, thickness, and shape of a tortilla chip flew up from the metal sheet he was cutting and made its way directly into his eye. He didn't yell in pain, nor was there any blood. He didn't even seem concerned or freaked out about his apparent eye trauma. It turned out that he was completely fine. Not even a scratch. Apparently the shard had wedged itself perfectly between his eyeball and tear duct, miraculously avoiding cutting either his eye or face. In light of recent events, however, I'm not so sure that explanation is entirely accurate. In the following months, Lawrence became more and more careless with his work. Not that he was doing a bad job, per se. The issue was that he was entirely ignoring safety guidelines. Evidently, he was always a little more lax when it came to that sort of thing, and he seemed to lack the self-preservation instincts that most people have. We would consistently remind him of the safety precautions, but he never really listened, claiming that it was easier to do the job without protective equipment. He was doing good work, so the higher-ups didn't really care if he broke a few guidelines. and nobody wanted to press the issue with him. I sincerely regret not making more of an attempt to intervene. I still struggle to wrap my head around what exactly happened to Lawrence that week. The things that I witnessed don't sound possible even to myself, but I'll do my best to articulate the events of my last day working for the company. For the first 3/4 of my workday, absolutely nothing was amiss or even mildly out of the ordinary. It was a Wednesday. The project I was working on was unremarkable. I was on a bit of a time crunch due to some external factors going on in my life I won't get into here. So I decided to work late so I could finish up what I was doing ahead of schedule and have a bit more free time later. Lawrence apparently also decided to work late, which wasn't surprising, as he did so somewhat often. As one might surmise based on his description, he wasn't really the type of guy to go out for some drinks with the boys. Instead of socializing, Lawrence was working a loft. I assume the majority of people reading this aren't very familiar with the types of machines used for the large-scale metalworking, so allow me to give a highly condensed version of what exactly we're dealing with. A metal lathe is sort of like a potter's wheel for metal, a turning machine that we use to cut, sand, and face metal. They allow us to cut metal extremely efficiently and symmetrically, and Lawrence stuck his hand in one. I have no idea why exactly he did so. I can only assume it was a careless mistake. The second his hand connected with the spinning rod of metal, he yelped in shock. Lawrence and I were the only two on that side of the factory floor, and I guess that means I was the only one besides him who saw the initial impact. I braced myself to be splattered with chunks of gore as my coworker was obliterated by an industrial machine, but the rain of blood, guts, and brain matter I was expecting never came. For an infinitely tiny fraction of a second, I thought maybe nothing had happened at all. But then I looked back up and my ephemeral relief was replaced by horror and confusion. There was no blood, no screaming. Lawrence only looked confused. His arm was caught around the metal rod he was cutting, but instead of being violently ripped from his body or sucking him into the machine, it was stretching. It seemed like he was made of clay until I heard the stomach-churning pop sound of his shoulder being pulled from its socket as he stumbled forward. His arms had wrapped around the rod dozens and dozens of times, looking like a coiled spring. He had a look of panic on his face. I guess he must have been frozen in shock, but he finally started to scream. In what felt like 20 minutes, but was really only half a second, his arms seemed to run out of slack, and his body was pulled into the lathe. At least, his upper half was. His legs stood in place as his torso stretched at its midsection, joining his arm in the spring-like coil. His screaming faded after a few rotations, giving way to a gurgling, retching sound. A small amount of vomit leaked from his mouth, little droplets of it landing on the floor and the walls as his upper body spun in place. At this point, I finally came to my senses and rushed to try to turn the thing off. I didn't actually have to do anything, however, because by the time my initial shock had subsided, the backed up folds of Lawrence's skin and flesh had jammed the machine. I had no idea what to do from there. In my dazed state, I hadn't noticed the guys who were working on the other side of the factory floor had gathered around. Everyone had this look in their eyes like I'd never seen. This horrified, confused, glazed-over look only present when one witnesses something beyond comprehension. I called the police, not able to fully explain what I'd just seen. I was probably babbling incoherently. The police arrived. They called who I assume was the FBI. The FBI guys called someone else. Soon enough, Lawrence's body was being unwound from the piece of steel by government officials and carried away. I thought he was dead. He was making a sound. I thought it was agonal breathing, or some sort of death rattle. But when I saw his face, I knew he was trying to speak. He was fully conscious. The image of his eyes as they made contact with mine will be laser cut into my retinas forever. Needless to say, I quit my job. The first incident occurred a week ago, 3 days after the mirror arrived. I woke up at 7:30 in the morning to a chilling cold, so disabling I could barely get out of bed. You might think that's just me being a dramatic teenager, but it was a cold like I'd never experienced before. It cut through the skin. I visited cousins in Norway on Christmas holidays that were warmer. My first thought was that the central heating hadn't been turned on, which was strange in itself considering that's the first thing my mom does in the morning. She wakes up each day at 6 on the dot, so when I got up an hour and a half later, the house is usually nice and toasty. I don't expect her to do these things like some spoiled brat, if that's what you're thinking. She just does them because she's a considerate mother. Anyway, I assume she had either slept through her alarm or that, for whatever reason, it had failed to go off. Jane Harris isn't exactly the type of person to sleep through an alarm, so I decided it must be the latter. Once I'd plucked up enough courage to confront the piercing cold, I headed for her bedroom. In the corridor, the wood flooring felt like ice beneath my bare feet, and I instantly regretted not putting my slippers on. Her door was closed when I reached it, which was odd because she usually keeps it slightly ajar for the cat to go in and out throughout the night. I put my ear to the solid wood but heard nothing. I knocked twice. No answer. I knocked again, the added force stinging my knuckles. Again, no answer. At this point I was quite worried, and a vicious image suddenly entered my mind of my mother in some type of danger. Hastily, I opened the door. However, when I entered the room, I saw that she wasn't in danger at all. In fact, she wasn't even asleep. She was sat in her chair, fully dressed, looking into the mirror. "Is everything okay, Mom?" I asked. At first she didn't notice me, but after a few seconds she caught my reflection and smiled. "Hello, darling," she said. I flinched. There was something about her voice, something that sounded off. I could feel my gut suddenly churn, and the sensation of a deep pit opening in my chest overwhelmed me. Inhaling deeply, I tried to gather myself, and then it hit me. I'd heard that voice before. It must be the cold, I quickly realized, shaking my head. God knows how long Mom has been sitting there wearing only her work clothes. She had probably caught the flu or something. "Are you okay?" I asked again. She didn't answer. "Mom?" I caught the hint of a frown in her mirror's reflection, so I called out to her again, and this time she turned around to face me. For a moment, it was like looking into the eyes of a stranger, and then she sprang to life. "Sorry," she said, color suddenly rushing into her face. "Something must have come over me." She pulled herself up from her chair, looked around the room and frowned. "Gosh, isn't it cold in here?" she remarked. The second incident happened yesterday. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to pee, accosted by the same violent cold. On my way to the bathroom, with my slippers on this time, I heard a noise from the end of the corridor. It was coming from my mom's room. Curious, I detoured towards the noise, my ears alert. It was dark in the corridor, so I tried flicking the table lamp on, and almost knocked a framed picture off the wall. It was my parents' old wedding photo, the only image of Dad Mom refused to take down. I turned on the lamp, readjusted the picture, and continued moving. I reached the end of the corridor and peeked my head around the corner. Again, Mom's door was closed, but I gathered she was awake from the thin glow beneath her door. And from the noises. They were louder now, and they were coming from her room. I crept silently forward, edging towards the door, turning my head to listen. It was a cry. Someone was in her room crying. A chill ran down my spine like a bolt. I wanted to run away, but my body propelled me forward. my hand reaching for the doorknob and twisting. I flung myself into her room. The cold was like a tundra. My mom was sitting in front of the mirror, staring into her reflection, her nightie barely covering her thin shoulders. Her body was still, but her mouth was open, and a deep cry, a man's cry, flooded out of it. A cry I'd heard before, but not from her lips. I screamed. I ran over to my mom and shook her. She remained still, completely unaware of my presence, her eyes hooked to the pair in the mirror. I reached beneath her arms and pulled her from the chair. Her body felt like the heaviest object in the world, and it took every inch of my strength to lift her. We both went crashing to the floor. The crying ceased. "What are you doing, Mom?" I said to her, still shaking. I helped her up off the floor, barely able to lift myself. Her face looked gaunt and frayed. "We need to get rid of that mirror," I told her. She turned to face me, her eyes like hollowed shells. "Your dad wouldn't like that," she said. And that's when I freaked out. My dad's been missing for almost 2 years. As soon as she said that, I left. I'm at my friend's house right now. I don't know how long I can stay here, but at some point, I need to return home. I don't know what to do. My mom insisted we spend the holidays at our cabin in the woods. She said it was the perfect place to become one with nature. I never liked it there. The cabin was old and creaky, buried under fresh snow that made everything silent and eerie. But my sister Tori didn't mind at all. She'd sit by the fireplace, flipping through Mom's worn-out fairy tales, her eyes shining like she knew a secret. One evening, as the shadows outside grew long and dark, Tori stared out the window. "Do you think Mom's stories are true?" she whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. I looked up from my book. "They're just stories," I said, trying to sound confident. "But what if something's out there?" she asked again, her voice barely audible. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. "You're letting your imagination run wild," I replied, forcing a smile. That night, Tori begged me to go into the forest with her. "Just for a little while," she pleaded. "I want to see if we can hear anything." I didn't want to go, but the look in her eyes made it hard to refuse. Reluctantly, I bundled up, and we stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under our boots as we walked into the trees. The forest was thick and dark, the branches above twisting together like a web. The paths we knew so well seemed different, like the woods had shifted when we weren't looking. "See? It's just trees and snow," I said, rubbing my arms to keep warm. Tori didn't answer. She was listening intently, her head tilted to the side. "Wait," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and strained to listen. At first there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the branches. Then, faintly, a whistle threaded through the air. It was a haunting sound, low and hollow, that sent a shiver through me. "It's just the wind," I said, but my voice shook. The whistle came again, clearer this time. It seemed to wrap around us, drawing us deeper into the woods. Before I could stop her, Tori stepped forward. "Maybe it's someone who needs help," she said, her eyes wide. "Wait." I reached out to grab her, but she moved too quickly, slipping between the trees. Panic gripped me as she disappeared from sight. "Tori?" I shouted, my voice echoing. The only answer was the whistle, now sounding like a mocking tune. I stumbled after her, the shadows pressing in. The trees seemed to close around me, their branches scratching at my clothes. My heart pounded in my chest. Then I saw it. In a clearing bathed in cold moonlight stood a towering figure. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Its body was thin and stretched, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Huge antlers twisted from its head, seeming to swallow the light and cloak it in darkness. Its eyes were empty holes, and from its jagged mouth came the haunting whistle. I stood frozen as it turned toward me. "Brooke," it whispered, my name distorted and echoing in the stillness. Fear rooted me to the spot. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature took a step closer, its movements smooth and eerie. Somehow I found the strength to turn and run. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my face as I fled. The whistle chased me, wrapping around me like a cold wind. I burst into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. "Mom?" I cried out, gasping for breath. The house was dark and silent. We need to, it's out there," I stammered, tears blurring my vision. A soft sound came from the back porch. Heart pounding, I crept toward it. Through the window, I saw her standing there, her back to me. Her body shook slightly, shadows swirling around her feet. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned slowly. Her eyes met mine, but they weren't the warm eyes I knew. They were hollow and empty, just like the creature's. A chilling smile spread across her face. "You're home, dear," she said, her voice layered with the haunting whistle. "We've been waiting for you." Behind her, Tori stepped into view. She moved stiffly like a puppet on strings. Her eyes were vacant, and as she opened her mouth, the whistle filled the room, echoing off the walls. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting with fear. The cabin seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching into monstrous shapes. It hit me all at once. The creature wasn't just in the woods. It was here, inside my home, wearing the faces of my family. Firstly, a quick introduction. I'm Cheryl and my husband is Mark. We're a husband and wife couple who were planning to start the Natural World Adventure Log, but my husband's injuries will make that impossible. We just want answers to what happened in the cave, but I think it's best to get everyone on the same page about Rockwell. Rock Well Caverns is a recently opened show cave somewhere in England. The exact location isn't something I can tell you right now, as news of this event seems to be getting removed for some reason. This might be tourism related, or it might be to prevent public paranoia. You'll see the caverns have a sort of spooky theme, with witches and skeletons and the like around the front entrance. This is sort of what attracted us to it, a new, unheard of location with a theme perfect for the Halloween season, which is when we planned of launching the channel. Okay, I'll speed up a little bit for Mark's sake. I'll get through the backstory in caves, then Mark can take over. With the condition his mouth's in, we have a system that allows him to dictate words to me using eye-tracking software. We arrived pretty early. I think we were the 20th or so visitor into the caves. The mouth was pretty unassuming, just a crack in the side of the valley wall, barely squeezing the metal walkway between the jagged sides. We traveled in groups of 10 to prevent the cave getting clogged with visitors. It was like walking through a portal. The warm summer air of outside quickly became colder, almost slimier, once we entered the caverns. It smelled of limestone. The smell so thick, I was almost worried my nose would clog up with limescale. The group was ushered into a chamber, one lit with thick red lights that cast elongated shadows across the damp walls. This is where we were told the backstory of this place. According to local legend, plants and crops around the town started to die off 1 week after a supposed witch was executed in the town center. Their roots turned to stone and flaked away. People who drank the water from the well wouldn't fare much better. Some would pass, as our tour guide called them, intestine stones. Others would have their insides turned to rock. They'd fall to the ground with a bone-cracking thud as the petrified organs slammed into their ribs. This was believed to be nothing more than a morbid tale inspired by the town's name, until a cave explorer discovered an underground lake. A petrifying well. Maybe you know of the petrifying well in Mother Shipton's Cave, North Yorkshire. A thin trickle of water coats any object placed under it with minerals over the course of months. This lake is like that, but stranger. The body of water is stagnant, and perhaps because of that, the effects are much faster. It takes seconds to coat something, not months. Nobody knows why. The visitor attraction is partly a way to get funding for experiments on the lake, but the working theory is the water's lack of movement, as well as lack of exposure to weather, allows the process to happen faster. My husband and I disagree. Deeper into the cave, the tour guide pointed out inscriptions on the walls. They are apparently indecipherable, but they could be phrases in an ancient language eroded to incomprehensibility. Mark's telling me he took some close-up shots of these, but with the camera and the state it's in, they'll be unrecoverable. From memory, they seemed almost geometric. The erosion theory seemed like a stretch with how preserved the shapes are. Mark also tells me of the rocks found on the floor. Some child in the first group found a gemstone, barely reachable from the walkway. I can remember a conversation between tour guides about whether he could keep it. Management got involved, but we're not sure what came of it. Mark believes this detail is important, and I almost forgot to mention it. I was more shaken by the gust of wind from deeper in the caves. It smelled even stronger than the cave's natural atmosphere. It almost felt sandy. I remember brushing some kind of powdered rock. It felt like salt off my face. The next chamber of the cave is the petrifying well. I'll give you a description of the room before I let Mark give his side of the story. The chamber is a massive dome shape. A row of electric lights were supposed to illuminate the pool, but some were out, coated in some kind of sediment. The dim light illuminated a milky pool below, surrounded by beaches of rough sand. We were on a metal platform, 10 meters above the pool. Around the railings, a series of metal wires acted as safety nets in case anybody lost their footing too near the edge. The smell was the strongest. Even the tour guide suggested only having a brief look at the pool and regrouping outside the chamber. In hindsight, everything was leading to what happened. Before Mark takes over, I'll say right now that the doctors found no evidence of head trauma. He's in a relatively sound mind, and I believe everything he's told me. I'll let him talk now. Why me? I can't stop thinking that. I've been told that if I have a positive outlook, it'll be better for me. Well, finding shoes in my size was always a hassle. I'm glad I'll never have to do that again. Anyway, I'll start properly now. I had this feeling in my stomach when we entered the chamber. It was like I swallowed an entire ice cube, but I just chalked it up to the stench that place gave off. The best description I can give is, it smelled like an old, damp church in the rain. The walkway was thin, the water was bubbling, the lights were dimming. I should have run out of there, but I just needed some footage of the pool. Everyone else had left, and they were congregating around the tour guide as I slowly walked back towards the crack in the wall that formed the chamber's entrance. I didn't even get halfway when a powerful gust of wind blew me back. It forced my scream of fear back into my lungs. I think you, he's referring to me, Cheryl, were out of the chamber when this happened. I let you go ahead so you could hear what the guide was saying. Each backward step I took felt lighter than the last, until I was totally weightless. The camera I tightly held onto flew out of my hands as I was launched over the railing. It felt like it took several hours. Flying over the safety nets and several meters into the pool can't have taken long, but my head was racing. Nothing seemed real. I couldn't process what was happening as cold cave air rushed past my head. Then I felt a splash. Sound became muffled. Powered by nothing but adrenaline, I forced my head above the water. For a split second, I thought the stories of the petrifying pool were exaggerated, that I was safe in the water. I reasoned that the heaviness of my lower body was due to my clothes being waterlogged, and that the tingling feeling on my face was just sediment from the pool. Luckily, I hadn't fallen too far away from the walkway, and underneath it was a rocky outcropping, just above the waterline. I'm not sure how I made it there, but when I did, I flopped onto the rock. It felt strange. Not the rock, but the impact. It was like my entire body was wrapped in a hard, rough bandage that dulled all sensation. Something was on me. I could barely see it in the dim lighting, but my coat and trousers had turned to stone and fused with my body. My vision became hazy and filled with dark splotches as I began to panic. I could hear you, me, Cheryl, screaming my name as light scanned the pool, so I tried to call back, but pain surged through my body as I did. My coat crumbled away, and it must have taken some flesh with it. The parts of my chest that weren't numb burned and screamed in agony. In a panic, I tried to grab my chest, but my left arm began to flake away. By the time I grabbed my crumbling body, it was only a stump. The water on my face hardened into dust. I brushed it off with sharp stings of pain as the rock was torn away, before everything turned black. I jolted back awake. At first I expected to be in my bed, maybe wrestling with you for the covers, but the stench of limestone quenched that fantasy. The lights were mostly out now. The cave became a wall of darkness. Everyone was gone. I assumed they left to get help, to start a search party. The skin I had left was sweaty and clammy. Intense nausea throttled my stomach as I rolled around on the rock. I couldn't feel it, but I knew fragments of rock were chipping off my body. Even my mouth was turning to stone. That was all I was, a lump of stone with a head. My face bled and I could feel several layers of rock scraping against each other as I moved. Well, I couldn't feel the rock, but I could feel the vibrations made by the friction, and the echoing of these vibrations in my teeth. I lay in a panic-induced haze when I heard a splash. A light flicked, illuminating the outline of a humanoid figure in the pool. That thing wasn't human. It was too thin. It looked more like a skeleton linked by just enough muscle to hold it together. I kicked and rocked, trying to move away from the water, when my shin slammed into the metal support of the walkway. As a metallic clang echoed out, I could feel me crumbling away. Something grabbed me and scraped my chest with what felt like a blunt metal pole. The light flickered again. This skeletal figure had me pinned down with its finger, and was scratching something into my skin. I tried to scream, but my mouth had completely hardened, with just a crack where it used to be. With as much power as I could muster, I kicked it with my remaining leg. A puff of dust erupted as my leg evaporated into powder. I covered my face with what I had left of my arms. When the light flickered off and a silence overcame the chamber, my stomach, drunk with nausea, churned and tightened. But I blacked out before I ever got the chance to throw up. Mark is getting exhausted from this now. He's listening to his favorite music. Of course, he made a pun about it being rock, to raise his spirits. We're not sure how long he'll survive in this condition, or if he'll ever make it out of the ICU, but he seems to be on the upturn now. But a few things have me concerned. In the weeks it took Mark to dictate his side of events to me, the camera was recovered from the pool. It was on the walkway but covered in a thick layer of sediment. Most of it was intact, but the rubber grips were turned to stone completely. The picture of the markings he took are exactly the same as the engraving on his chest. Some say that he did that to himself in a state of panic, but that can't be true. The fragment of fingernail found in the scratches are old, way older than 43. The cave is pending investigation, and nobody can understand what caused the wind, and rumor has it that the rock found by the child was a currently unclassified type of gemstone. But what really has me scared is the black lump on my hand. It's heavy and hard, like stone. I never touched the pool, only Mark. Does anyone know if this petrification is contagious? Does anyone know anything about the curse of Rock Well Caverns? My eyes blinked open to the soft, pale glow of the morning light filtering through the curtains. I lay still, my body sunken into the familiar dip on my side of the bed, the weight of sleep lingering in my limbs. The silence was comforting, and I reached across the mattress, expecting to feel the warmth of my wife beside me. Her side was empty. I frowned, my fingers brushing the cold, undisturbed sheets. Lisa never woke before me on her days off. I pushed the thought aside, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. Maybe she'd gone to the bathroom or been called into the ER last minute. They were always short-staffed these days. I glanced at the old wooden clock hanging above the dresser. 6:17 a.m. Too early for Lisa. My stomach nodded with unease, but I told myself not to worry yet. Maybe she was downstairs making breakfast. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and was greeted by Middo, our cat. He wove between my legs, his purring loud and insistent. I reached down to stroke him absent-mindedly before stumbling into the bathroom, the chill of the house creeping into my skin. The stillness of the house unnerved me as I splashed cold water on my face. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater kicking on, filling the empty spaces with a mechanical, distant drone. I pulled on my housecoat and headed down the dimly lit hallway, Middo at my heels. Coffee first. The thought was comforting, routine. I moved toward the kitchen, but something stopped me. Middo's bowl was empty. Strange. Lisa was always the first to feed him in the mornings. A flicker of confusion passed through me, and my gaze fell on her purse, hanging from the back of the kitchen chair. Her car keys were still on the rack by the front door. A sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck. I crossed the room to the living room window, brushing aside the heavy curtains. The landscape outside was barren under the pale winter sky, the frost glistening in the early morning light. Lisa's car sat in the driveway, untouched. "Babe, you home?" I called, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. No answer. I fed Middo, his purring louder than ever, as the coffee maker began to slow drip. I waited, tapping my fingers against the counter, trying to shake the creeping dread building in my chest. Something was off. I grabbed my phone from the bedroom, hoping for a message. Nothing. I hit the call button, but my heart sank when I heard her ringtone, a familiar melody vibrating from her nightstand. She hadn't taken her phone. Now the worry set in, sharp and sudden. I threw on yesterday's clothes, my fingers fumbling as I laced up my shoes and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, biting through my thin layers. The house stood alone on the outskirts of town, fields and forests stretching for miles. There was no movement, no sound but the whistle of the wind through the trees. Then I saw her. Lisa stood at the far edge of the property, just before the dark line of trees that bordered our land. She was still in her pajamas, her thin silk nightgown a stark contrast to the frozen landscape. Her back was to the forest facing me, unmoving. "Lisa?" I called, my voice quivering slightly. "What are you doing? It's freezing out here." She didn't move. She didn't respond. I took a few steps toward her, my heart pounding harder with each one. A strange sense of dread clawed at my chest. As I approached, she began to move backward. She was still facing me, but her steps were slow, deliberate, retreating into the shadows of the forest. The trees seemed to swallow her whole. Lisa? I yelled, breaking into a run. Wait, stop. She disappeared into the trees. I stopped at the edge of the forest, the towering pines looming overhead, casting long, dark shadows across the frozen ground. The cold felt sharper here, biting deeper, as if the forest itself was colder than the rest of the world. I hesitated, my breath clouding the air in front of me. Everything about this was wrong. Lisa hated the cold. She wouldn't wander into the woods in a nightgown, not in this weather. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the trees. The world changed instantly. The sounds of the wind and the distant hum of the house disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence. My footsteps were muted on the frozen ground, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Lisa? I called, my voice small in the vastness of the woods. No answer. The trees crowded in on me, their dark branches like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. I moved deeper, my eyes straining to see through the thick underbrush. Every shadow seemed to shift, every tree standing like a silent, watching sentinel. The cold bit through my clothes, but I pressed on, my pulse quickening with each step. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind. Edgar. I froze. It was Lisa's voice, but something about it was wrong. Too delicate, too close. Lisa? I called, spinning around. Where are you? The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then once again the voice came. Edgar, this way. The voice echoed from deeper in the woods, sending a shiver down my spine. Without thinking, I ran toward it, the panic now fully taking hold. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to rise up from the ground, snagging my feet and tearing at my clothes. The cold air burned in my lungs as I stumbled through the forest. Finally, I broke through the trees into a large clearing. The ground was frozen, barren, and lifeless, the trees forming a circle around me like towering sentinels. At the far edge of the clearing I saw her. Lisa. She was hunched over, her back to me, her nightgown streaked with dirt and blood. Her shoulders shook with soft, pitiful sobs. Lisa? My voice cracked, tears of relief welling in my eyes. Before I could take a step, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. Startled, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was Lisa's number. A cold wave of confusion and dread crashed over me. I looked from the phone to the figure in the clearing, my heart pounding in my ears. With a shaking hand I answered. Hello? Edgar? Lisa's voice came through, frantic and full of fear. Where are you? I've been trying to call you for hours. My throat tightened. What? I'm in the woods. Where are you? I'm at home, she cried. I went out for breakfast with Lacey, and when I came back, you were gone. I've been calling and calling. I stared at the figure in the clearing, still sobbing, still covered in blood. My mind reeled as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. Lisa, if you're home, then who? The line cut off. The phone in my hand going dead as the battery drained in an instant. I stared at the dark screen, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The sobbing stopped, but was replaced with a soft, creeping giggle. My arms hung at strange angles, twisted and contorted unnaturally. She took a step backwards towards me, then another, her body jerking and spasming with each movement. Run, she whispered, her voice no longer human. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I tore through the forest. The laughter echoed, behind me growing louder and more hysterical, a sound that chilled me to my very core. My heart pounded, my breath came in ragged gasps. And still I ran faster than I ever thought possible. Branches lashed at me, roots tripped me, but I didn't care. I could hear her. No, it closing in. Its twisted limbs crashing through the underbrush, its laughter ringing in my ears. Finally, the edge of the woods came into view. I threw myself through the trees and collapsed into the frozen grass, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by paramedics, friends, and Lisa. The real Lisa. She was holding my head in her lap, her face streaked with tears. They told me I'd been missing for 6 hours. I said nothing. I couldn't explain what had happened. No one would believe me if I tried, so I told them I didn't remember anything after making coffee that morning. But I know what I saw. They kept me in the hospital for a few days running tests and scans for my brain to make sure my breakdown wasn't related to something serious. When the tests came back clear, I was prescribed some medication and ordered to see a psychiatrist once a month for 3 months. And then they sent me home with a note granting me 1 month of paid leave from work. Lisa took a couple weeks off work to stay with me. She never left my side. Wherever I was, she was. Admittedly, it was hard looking at her the same way after what happened. I felt paranoid, uneasy, terrified that whatever chased me through the woods was still out there, just waiting for me to come back. Or maybe it would come for me in the night. I hardly sleep anymore. I spend nights listening to the ticking clock above the dresser while who I think is Lisa sleeps soundly next to me. A few days ago, I was in the basement doing the laundry. It's a chore that both Lisa and I tend to procrastinate on. I pulled out an armful of dirty clothes from the overflowing laundry basket and stuffed them into the washer. I looked back into the basket and froze. In the bottom of the basket was Lisa's nightgown, the same one that thing had been wearing in the woods. An awful feeling blanketed over me as flashbacks filled my head. It became worse when I reached in and pulled it out. Her nightgown was tattered and torn, stained with dirt and dried blood. So a little context to this. I'm a young guy in a town that no one in the last century would be able to pick out on a map, and I met someone who I don't think was human. It all started out so very plain. I woke up on a crappy bed that should have been thrown out last year with springs that are killing my back. Went to work at 8 at the Home Depot on the only road that ever gets any traffic, but it's still just a 10-minute drive from my house. Work just passed by. A few customers would come in to get big loads for construction sites, but they mostly just need us for the forklift. They already know where pretty much everything is. And almost all the rest of the customers were looking for returns and refunds, or which aisle the bathroom seats were on. I clocked out at 4. Nothing exciting happened. No weird customer. Nothing. I went home and tried to make something resembling a stir fry, but I realized a bit too late I was missing half the ingredients that made it any good. So I decided to go to the store to see if anything was on sale to make the food taste like food. Food prices are far too high for someone making barely 15 an hour. Basically robbery if you ask me. I must have sat there circulating my budget with my stomach for a good hour before deciding on some cheap frozen veggies. And the smallest bottle of soy sauce I'd ever seen. People don't appreciate the relationship they have with food nearly enough. I haven't eaten the same since that day. It happened while I was leaving the store. It was almost like a grunting and grinding sound mixed with weird muffled noises. I know I should have just minded my own business and kept it pushing, but something broke through. I couldn't see anything and couldn't hear it well, but I did recognize one thing. A cry being muffled by a hand is something that even if you've never heard it before, your brain just knows what it is. It makes you want to see what it was. So I put my stuff down in my car, and I go over to check what the noise was about. Dumb, I know, but what can I say? Habits are hard to break, and I don't know what else to do with them. I don't see it when rounding the corner. It's a weird array of buildings, and the lights seem to be the only on in the parking lot. It wasn't pitch black out, but not much better than the lights too far. So I walk into what looks like an area for employees to go in through the back, and that's when I see them. There must have been at least 6 guys on the ground. It was hard to tell with some of them being on top of each other, but that's not what caught my attention. The girls, or women maybe, I don't know how old they were, but they looked college age. There was 4 of them. I knew because they were just sitting there staring, hands over their mouths trying to push the cries back in, almost scared to make a sound. Yet none of them seemed to be gearing to run away. Almost like they were in a panic attack but trying to put it in a box, if that makes sense. But the strangest thing of all was the guy standing next to the guys on the pavement. He looked as if he had just come into the situation too. He didn't feel hostile, you know? Like that feeling you get when someone's been aggressive or threatening just wasn't there. He seemed almost bored. The closer I got, the more things I noticed about the scene. By the time I stopped, I was about 30 feet away. I could start to make out some objects on the ground. Pipes and broken glass. A broken piece of wood. Almost all of it had some trace of struggle tied to it. None of the girls or the guy had any signs of struggle or something that made me think they had anything to do with the fight. The guy standing there looked to be early 20s. Light skin and couldn't have been taller than 5'11". He had almost black hair, or maybe it was dark brown. Hard to tell. Just an average guy you'd pass on the streets. But then I saw his eyes. They were so brown. And what first looked like boredom, on closer look almost seemed like... I don't know what the word for it is. Like someone looking for the secret image in a picture but can't quite tell if it's even there. I don't know what made me not call out or ask him what happened. After all, this whole situation felt off. Did a big fight happen? Was he involved or just a passerby? Why wouldn't the girls take their eyes off him? And then he looked over to me. He didn't say anything, but I could almost feel the words popping in my head from his stare. Like, as if he was saying something about modern art or the state of affairs of young people. As if the vision couldn't be realized and he couldn't be bothered to try and understand anymore. Well, he kept taking glances at me. He began to walk around looking at the debris, like he was searching for something in particular. He kept giving me side glances, almost as if picking out a gift for a friend, and he couldn't decide. The girl started crying harder as he moved, almost petrified when he came near them. Finally, he picked up a piece of rebar and inspected it closely and gave me a look of something along the lines of a mighty sword. And he swished it around him like a kid playing with his new favorite stick. Then he threw it near my feet. The sound of metal and concrete will never be the same to me again. Then, while I'm looking between him and the rebar, a small grin began to form on his face with a look of, "You don't like my present?" My brain, being sensible, told me I should pick it up. After all, if he was the one who messed up 6 guys by himself, a weapon was mandatory. Quick of a thought that was, came something far more sinister. The grin was beginning to widen and morph to a bigger smile. His feet, I noticed, were almost sideways. His legs sounded heavy, and the way he walked seemed almost as if it took great effort to do so. He walked so casually, as if he was about to greet a long-time friend he hadn't seen or heard from in a while. Maybe that's what it would have looked like from a camera. Every one of his steps triggered something in me, something almost instinctual. I still hadn't said anything, and I barely so much as twitched, but I knew what this feeling was. Prey isn't the right word for it. I was a part of the dinner now. Something like a cat would do with a mouse he had no interest in eating, only making it suffer before the end, priding itself on the pain of things weaker than it. It was suffocating when he was in front of me. He looked down at the rebar and then back at me, almost pleading for me to pick it up, like a kid whose dad won't play make-believe anymore. When I didn't move, he lifted his arm and pointed at me, close enough to almost be touching me, but not quite there. His eyes gave me a look of, "I'm not touching you." One of the girls was starting to curl up in her knees, but her hand never left her mouth. Then he did something strange. Keeping his finger pointed at me, he slowly began walking in a circle around me. I stared straight forward, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way around. The first time he came around, his smile was still playful, but he stopped right in front of me again. He held a finger up and looked at me as if I had one of something. Then I realized he was telling me I had one question, so I asked him the only question I could think of. "What are you?" His smile got larger. "Hungry." Almost too high of a voice for a man. Almost slurred. Then he began walking around me again, but this time felt different. When he stopped behind me, the girls' faces changed and the cries almost couldn't be covered anymore. Everything in me was telling me to turn around and try to fight for my life before the thing behind me took it without a fight. But I did nothing. As he was coming over my other side, his smile hadn't changed, but the way his eyes looked hasn't left me. Almost like he had sunk further into his face, but they contained an anger that hadn't been there before. But just like last time, he held up one finger, only this time I couldn't think of a better question. Then it came to me. "Who are you?" I barely stuttered out. His smile almost seemed to tear at the points of his mouth as he spoke. "Fun." Only this time his voice was almost split, like two people saying it at once. He tilted his head from side to side, almost debating on his next course of action. He settled on walking around me again, only this time he didn't stop behind me. His face looked almost unreal as he rounded my side, like it couldn't decide if he was experiencing euphoria or anger so hot it would burn him alive. This time, though, the finger that had been pointing at me was the one he held up. He kept making a swirly motion with it, as if telling me this would be the last question. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say so I could leave alive. I thought about asking to leave, but what about the rest of the people here? What happens once I leave? I still didn't understand what was happening now. I could only think of one thing to make it stop. One way so the girls and those guys might be able to leave so that someone might survive. I tried to summon all the bravery I didn't have to ask him the next question. "Can you please leave?" I squeaked out. I don't think that's what he wanted to hear. His hand came right in front of my neck and he began snarling at me. He moved forward and began sniffing around me, almost smelling for something. It took him a minute before he seemed satisfied. Well, he pulled away. The look on his face began to change back to how he was when I first came over, but it had almost an amused look to it, like he had never been asked that question before. Then he leaned in too close to my neck and ear. His breath was so cold, if I couldn't see him in front of me, I would think a freezer might have opened right next to me. He whispered the last thing he said to me in my ear, but being careful not to touch me. "All right." His voice sounded almost monotone, like his fun had been killed. And then he began walking away into the darker parts of the night. I could hear him humming. It felt like hours before anyone moved, almost scared to do anything to bring that thing back over. Finally, one of the girls crawled over to one of the guys and began sobbing on his chest. And that's all it took for everything to turn into a blur of motion. I checked my phone and it hadn't been 30 minutes since I first walked over. As the rest of the guys began waking up, I noticed something strange going on between them. One of the guys almost jumped up and about fell over again looking for something. He left. I told him, but it didn't seem to be the response he was looking for. "Where's Alice? Where's Jenny?" This made the girls break down sobbing, and what they said next broke my heart. I should have realized it sooner. There was 6 guys and 4 girls when I arrived. That didn't mean that's all who came. One of the girls spoke up and said something barely understandable through her crying. "He ate them. He ate them," she said as she screamed the last part before her forehead touched the ground and her back began to heave as she struggled to breathe. I tried to talk to one of them about what happened, but no one seemed to want to say what exactly happened. But then the guy who asked about the girls looked at me, and then he looked at the ground. We were just messing around, just talking about where we wanted to get something to eat that had enough space for all of us. He looked back up to me, tears in his eyes, almost pleading with me to understand him. Then he continued. "We go to the college at the edge of town. It's only a 20-minute walk to the restaurants, and we were just taking a shortcut when we..." He stopped halfway, almost scared to say what happened next. Then we saw him standing there looking up at the sky, giggling to himself. He paused for a moment, then continued. I asked him what was so funny about the sky, but he ignored me and kept giggling to himself. "You should have left him alone. All of you guys should have left him alone," the girl next to him half screamed into his ear. I didn't know. He looked back up at me, but this time he was ashamed. He wasn't doing wrong, we just thought he was slow and it would be fun to mess with him a bit. So we walked up to him and began asking him questions. "What questions?" I interrupted him. "Just dumb stuff, you know? Like who he was and what he was doing giggling at the night sky behind a store. Everything was fine until..." He paused again. "Until we started touching him." I looked at him in disbelief. Questions burning on my mind on what the hell it took for them to think that any of what they did was okay. But I needed different answers. At first it was just us touching his clothes. He never stopped smiling, so we thought it wouldn't hurt for us. "You thought he was harmless, you mean?" I cut him off again, only this time it was of frustration. "Yeah, we thought he was harmless, okay? Is that what you wanted to hear, huh? It's not like we were beating on him. We were just playing around." "Until we weren't." His eyes looked almost crazed with grief at this point. He was so fast and strong, almost like he wasn't even human. At first he was just throwing us around until Jake picked up a pipe and swung it at him. After that he stopped pulling the punches and then it goes dark. He finished looking at the girls for an explanation. The brunette girl was the one who began talking despite looking in between her knees, almost too scared to look at the world, at the night. "After he laid all of you out, he kept hitting you guys, so we tried to get him off you. She stopped and then started again. Alice and Jenny hopping on his back, but it didn't matter. He slammed both of them into the pavement, just as quick. But then he looked at us and we saw his face." "What about his face?" I asked. A different girl spoke up this time. "It wasn't normal. It almost looked like a mask of a face twisted in anger. But we all could feel the threat in the air." "What threat?" "If we moved or made a sound, we'd die," she said quietly. But Jenny and Alice didn't want him to go back to beating the guys, so they fought back. It was another couple of minutes before anyone said anything, but then she finally started up again. Jenny was the first one he started on. Her voice wavered. He grabbed her by her hair and thigh and shoved her down his mouth, and then in went Jenny. She finished, and then she looked over to me, and then you walked over, taking another breath. And then we thought there was two of them. All of them broke down at the statement of not knowing what else to do. We decided to call the cops. We decided to tell them that a man who fit a description of the thing that came here tonight had abducted the two girls at gunpoint rather than what actually happened. No one would have believed anything about that night. The cops grilled all of us for weeks and pulled all the camera footage they could find, but the girls and the thing were never found again. Just gone. Like he had never been there that night. Even now my hands and fingers are shaking as I type this out, trying to rationalize what happened as if words could ever capture the feeling of terror of that night. Of him. I know no one who reads this is gonna believe this, so I'll only ask you one thing. No matter what they say or what they look like, don't talk to the things that roam at night. You never know if they've eaten yet. My group of friends has always liked the outdoors. The four of us have always enjoyed a weekend of camping and fishing. I would have never guessed it was going to turn out like this. I always hear stories of crazy things happening out in the woods, but I never thought it would happen to us. Last weekend wasn't out of the ordinary to begin with. We packed up and headed out to do some backcountry camping. We heard of a new place near a lake where my distant friend had been once or twice. We were told that this area was quiet and had great fishing. Our group consists of 4 guys who have loved camping in the wilderness for our whole lives. Todd is maybe the roughest of the 4. He stands at 6'3" and is up for almost anything. Ryan is definitely the smart one in the group. He usually doesn't let Todd do the dumb things he wants to. I honestly think Todd might have been sent to the hospital a couple dozen times if it weren't for Ryan. To be honest, I don't add much to the group. I'm just here for the good time and really follow what everyone else is doing. Liam is a little bit different. Before last weekend, I would have called him the skittish one, never really wanting to do any of the stuff we're getting ourselves into. Not to make fun of the guy, but he just usually doesn't get into trouble. It's for this reason that I have such a hard time trying to stomach the things that I saw this weekend. We hiked for about 2 hours to find the perfect place to set up camp. God, it was beautiful out there. A nice open place right beside the lake. The water looked almost like glass with the reflection of the hot sun shining up to shore. Who knew a place so beautiful could be filled with so much horror? We decided to take 2 tents instead of 4 this weekend to conserve some weight. I got bunked with Ryan, and Todd was set up with Liam. Before we had even finished getting camp set up, Todd had started to blow up his inflatable kayak. Liam was trying to get Todd to help finish setting up their tent, but Todd didn't really care. I'm lucky I got set up with Ryan because he has a serious work before play mentality. Todd was already on the water by the time we had finished setting up. I was ready to join him as we only had a few hours of daylight left. Ryan and Liam weren't too keen about going fishing right away, and suggested going on a hike to check out the area. I'm not one for hiking, and Todd isn't either, so me and Todd set out on the water while Liam and Ryan went out to the woods. After about 2.5 hours of no luck on the water, we paddled back into camp. It was getting close to dark and we were hungry. Back at camp, Ryan and Liam were sitting by a newly lit fire. Before I even stepped a foot on that campsite, I knew something was wrong. A tightness in my chest that felt like a hand squeezing from the inside. As we walked up to camp, I got my first look at the source of the bad feeling. "Look what I found," Liam yelled with a smile. The volume of his voice startled me and I took a small step back. In his hand there was a small wooden doll. When I laid my eyes on it, my heart skipped a beat. I was frozen in place for a moment, unable to move. Hesitant, I walked up to get a closer look. It looked like one of those creatures from the movie Trolls, only slightly chunkier and without the crazy hair. It fit in the palm of his hand and had an eerie feeling to it. Suddenly I had the urge to take it. It felt as if an unknown force had thrusted my arm outward to grab this trinket from the hands of my friend. Almost with the same force, Liam instantly pulled back his hand. His eyes filled with rage. Not just a joking rage you use when you yell at your friends about something stupid. A pure, real rage. "No," he said firmly with a voice that echoed across the lake. As quickly as the urge came to take the doll, it was gone. My lungs felt empty and my heart just the same. I took a deep breath and looked at Liam, hoping his rage had left him too. It hadn't. He looked at me with the same rage in his eyes, staring. "Sorry, I don't know what came over me," I muttered with a neutral tone. I had never seen Liam like this before. He was usually so kind. I looked at both Todd and Ryan. They looked both as confused as me. Eventually Liam's rage disappeared and he went back to normal. Well, not normal, there was something off with him. I knew it was because of that doll. We roasted some hot dogs and talked about the fire as the sun set. Liam was oddly quiet during our conversations. He didn't say a single word and ate in silence. He only perked up when we mentioned the doll. "So where'd you find that thing anyway?" Todd asked with his mouth half full of hot dog. Ryan looked at Liam to answer, but he just sat there silently staring. Ryan answered, "It was inside of a tree. Maybe a squirrel hole or something, I'm not sure. I went to grab it, but Liam... It's mine." A chill trickled down my spine. After an hour of not speaking, the only words he says, "It's mine." 2 simple words. 2 words that chilled me to the core. He stared at the 3 of us with a deadly look in his eyes and didn't move a muscle. "What's going on with your eyes, man?" Ryan asks. He was right. There was something off. Liam's eyes were always bright blue, but now they seemed darker. A kind of gross yellow. Almost what I'd imagine a wolf to have. Liam didn't respond, just sat there clutching his doll so tightly in his hands that his knuckles were turning white. Something was terribly off with him. That doll was affecting him in some way none of us could comprehend. We took a second to grab our bearings and continue to talk. Somehow we shrugged off the odd things that were happening to Liam. I know now that we should have taken that doll away from him. If he had, I'd still see Liam as the nice guy I know he truly is. Once we went to bed, it was when the real terror started. Me and Ryan shut out the lights not long after we got in our tent. It was hard to sleep with the sound from the other tent. Todd and Liam were arguing about something, and it sounded pretty heated. I never asked Todd what the argument was about, but I assume it was about the doll. The argument went on for about a half hour until it suddenly stopped. All I could hear was the sound of the frogs croaking and the odd chirp from a bird. Then I heard footsteps going out into the woods from our campsite, slowly growing more distant and eventually out of earshot altogether. I assumed that Todd had gotten pissed off at Liam and went to take a pee or something. The only problem? I saw no flashlight go out into the woods. I looked over at Ryan, but he seemed to be asleep. I played there and thought for a few minutes. I figured I'd better check in on the other tent to see what was going on. I slowly climbed over top of Ryan to get out of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over. I zipped open the other tent and I saw Todd sitting there in his underwear alone. "Where the hell is Liam?" I asked quietly. "I don't know, he just got up and left," Todd said without a care in the world. "He didn't even take a flashlight." It only struck me then how out of character this was. Liam wouldn't even go out in the woods alone with a flashlight. Never mind in the dark without one. He must be really pissed or something is terribly wrong. "Don't you think we should go find him?" I asked with a hint of frustration. "Liam does not want to talk to me right now." I could tell that Todd was afraid by the way he muttered his next words. "Something is wrong with him, man. I don't think anyone should be near him right now." I left without saying another word to Todd. Once he makes a decision, he's set in his ways. I knew he wasn't stepping a foot out into those woods. I thought he was just being dramatic, making an excuse to stay safe in that tent. Todd could not have been more right. I wish I had known. I shook Ryan awake and told him Liam was alone in the woods without a flashlight. "That idiot," Ryan spat out as he threw some pants on. It's not often that good Christian Ryan uses the Lord's name in vain. I guess he just wasn't too happy about being woken up in the middle of the night. We flicked on our flashlights and pointed them in the woods. Even with the beams shining full blast, the woods were as dark as ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something awful would happen in those woods. Every minute in those woods felt like they dragged on for hours. I could feel my heart pounding on my chest like an animal trying to break free. The horrible feeling I had when I saw that doll had come back. It had never felt more real. The only thing keeping me sane was the sounds of the forest. It's usually not comforted by buzzing bugs or screaming crows, but something about the noise calmed me. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes when we found Liam. The noises of the surrounding forest cut out instantly, like someone had just pressed pause on their phone. Me and Ryan stopped and froze, as if we had turned to stone on the spot. I had never felt so vulnerable. I had the feeling I was being watched. I could see Liam's yellowed eyes in the back of my head, piercing my mind. I knew that he was looking at me. I just couldn't find out where. I snapped out of my petrified stance and started to look around. Ryan quickly followed suit. I couldn't see a thing. Even with the flashlights, the darkness had consumed the forest around us. Something broke the silence, barely audible, but it was there. A labored breath, almost like a panting dog. The sound that was so quiet was somehow so loud. It consumed everything around me. I couldn't place where it was coming from. Again, I froze in place. Something had fallen on my shoulder. I reached my hand up to touch the foreign object. It was wet. Wet? What out here would fall on my shoulder that's wet? I pointed the flashlight at my hand. It was red, dark red. It was a drop of blood. I felt my ears pounding with the beat of my heart as I looked at the liquid on my finger. The only place it could have came from was up. I looked above me and saw the source of the breathing, a pair of yellow eyes looking straight at me. That stare locked me in place. Any muscle I tried to move was halted by an unseen force. It was up high, really high, higher than any man I knew could climb. Up there on that tree perched the man I knew as Liam. His body was darker than the night itself. His arms looked to had grown a foot in length. His legs, too. Maybe my mind was just painting a grim portrait, but I swear his body was different. I couldn't make out a single facial feature. All I saw was a blank canvas with those glowing yellow eyes. I knew it was Liam. I remembered those eyes by the fire as if it happened 5 minutes before. It was him. It was Liam. Under one of his large hands looked to be a small rodent, or at least what was left of one. I remember it so clearly. Every time I close my eyes, I can see those eyes staring at me. Like the snap of a rubber band, I regained control of my body. I ran. I ran back to camp faster than I've ever ran before. I could only hope Ryan was following me because I was not looking back. I entered the clearing of our campsite and saw Todd standing in front of his tent. "What's going on? I heard screaming." I don't recall screaming or even making a single sound. Ryan must have cried out while I left him there. I looked at the kayaks on shore, and no, that was the only way to be safe. "Get in a boat," I screamed at Todd. I looked back at the forest and I saw Ryan running into the clearing with his eyes wide. He stopped for a second and clutched his heart to catch his breath. "Boat!" I screamed, this time directed at Ryan. As I looked back, Todd had one kayak in the water, dragging a second. As quickly as before, I ran to the boat and jumped in. Ryan followed not far behind. I paddled and paddled until my arms gave out, only looking back to see that Ryan and Todd were close behind me. "What happened? Why are we out here? It's cold," Todd yelled with confusion. I hadn't even noticed he was still in his underwear. This was the least of my worries at this point. Neither me nor Ryan felt the need to answer Todd, too petrified to say a word about our experience. My heart had finally decided to slow down. A part of me wanted to look back at our camp, see if that creature was there watching us out in the lake. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the strength to look. Without saying another word, I laid down in my inflatable kayak. The small waves rocking me back and forth made my eyes feel heavy. I eventually dozed off. I woke up to the bright light of the shining sun. The rocking sensation I felt the night before had disappeared. I looked around and saw that I was beached up on a rocky shore. It was on the same side of the lake as the campsite. I could see my neon green tent not 300 feet from where I had landed. Along with the tent was 2 kayaks up on the shore. Someone had gone back. Who would be so stupid to go back to shore with Liam around? If Ryan had seen what I saw, there's no way he would have gone back. It had to be Todd. I looked around me again. I saw Ryan's kayak not too far from me. He had ended up quite close to where I was, about 20 feet further from the camp than me. I paddled over to Ryan and gave him a few pokes with my paddle until he woke up. Todd went back, I said calmly to Ryan. Even being awake for seconds, Ryan knew how dire this situation was. He did what? He asked me firmly. It was less of a question and more trying to cope with what he had just heard. He kicked off and we paddled back to the campsite. Strangely, nothing felt off when we approached the campsite. Nothing like what I had felt coming back the day prior. I just knew. I knew by some feeling in the back of my mind that the doll was nowhere around our campsite. We beached our kayaks and hopped out onto dry land. Once I stepped on that rocky shore, the uneasy feeling returned. This time it wasn't about Liam. It was about Todd. After the walk back to the truck, Ryan called, and police were within 3 minutes. I told them that Todd and Liam must have gone out into the woods in the night and didn't come back. We woke up to find neither Todd nor Liam asleep in their tent. Ryan told them a similar story. Not one of us said a word about the doll, or what we saw in the woods the night before. As of now, the investigation is still ongoing. It's Wednesday now. They went missing Friday night. I have no doubt that Liam is still out there somewhere. A little piece in the back of my mind, like a distant memory trying to pry its way out. I can hear what sounds like Todd screaming. Not a scream like I've ever heard from him. A scream of terror. I didn't mean to make a wall of text like I did here, but I couldn't really sum it up with less words. You have any questions about this experience? Maybe something I missed, please ask. I'm writing this late at night, and I'm far from an author. I apologize for any grammar mistakes or anything of the sort. So this happened about 10 years ago when I was working as a cab driver in New York City. I'd lived there almost all of my life, and this was when I had just started driving. I think it was my first or second week. Not really sure. Anyway, one night I got a call to pick someone up. I remember it was late, around 2 or 3 a.m., and the streets were pretty quiet. I waited outside for about 5 minutes, but nobody came out. That happens sometimes. People order a ride and then either forget about it or decide not to go. After waiting a bit longer, I decided to cancel the ride and just move on. This was in the Bronx, by the way, and as I was making a turn to head back to the main road, something really strange happened. Out of nowhere, this girl knocks on my window. And when I say out of nowhere, I mean it. I didn't hear her walking up or anything. She just appeared, like she came out of thin air. She looked pretty normal though. Young, maybe mid-20s, wearing simple clothes. She asks me if I'm working and I said yeah. Then she tells me where she's going and asks how much I charge. Now, since I was new to the job, I didn't really know what to charge, so I just asked her how much she usually paid. She said $10 and I was like, alright, cool. She gets in the back seat, and as soon as she sits down, she asks me to turn off the AC and the music. That was weird because it was summer, and it was really hot that night. I wasn't blasting the AC or anything, just keeping the car cool. But she seemed uncomfortable. Still, I did what she asked. It's not uncommon for passengers to make little requests like that. The weird thing, though, is that she didn't say another word after that. Nothing. Usually passengers either chat or sit there quietly scrolling on their phones, but she just sat there staring out the window. I thought maybe she was tired or something, so I didn't think that much of it at first. When we got close to the destination, I asked her for her building number. No response. I asked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. That's when I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there was no one there. She was gone. I freaked out. My first thought was that maybe she got out of the car while we were stopped at a light or something, but that didn't make sense. The doors were locked, and I would have heard or felt the door open. I pulled over, got out, and checked the back seat, but there was nobody there. I know for a fact that she got in the car. I talked to her. She was there, but she just vanished. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I wasn't tired, I wasn't imagining things, and I don't drink or do drugs. This was real. It's probably the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me, or at least one of them. I still think about it sometimes.